in, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Tonight we explore 5 first-hand accounts of quiet terror, stories collected from whispers and personal testimonies, all meant to guide you gently into a state of relaxation. These are not tales of sudden shocks, but of slow, creeping dread that settles in the quiet moments. The first story begins not with a scream, but with a sound many of us know well: the ring of a phone in the dead of night. A call that, by all logic, should never have come through. Story 1. The wrong number. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a violent shudder in the otherwise perfect stillness of 3 a.m. The screen glowed with the words, "Unknown number." I almost ignored it, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But a strange compulsion made me answer. There was no greeting, only the sound of labored breathing, shallow and wet, as if the caller was struggling for air. Then, a voice, little more than a whisper, rasped a single word. "Eleanor." My name is not Eleanor. A prank call, I thought, a wrong number fueled by late-night foolishness. I was about to hang up when I heard it, a faint, familiar creak in the hallway outside my bedroom door. The same floorboard that always protests under the slightest weight. The breathing on the phone hitched, synchronized with the sound. My blood went cold. The call wasn't coming from some distant location. It was a live feed from inside my own house. The whisper came again, closer this time, more insistent. "Eleanor." It was followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching my door. The dread was a physical weight, pressing me into the mattress. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The doorknob began to turn, a slow, deliberate rotation I could both see and hear through the phone's receiver. The final, chilling revelation washed over me. The caller wasn't outside my door. They were already in the room with me, their whispered voice in my ear both through the phone and from the shadows in the corner. The line went dead a second before the figure lunged. Story 2. The Watcher in the Woods. Moving deeper into the stillness, we find a different kind of terror. One born not within the walls of a home, but in the vast, ancient silence of the wilderness. This account comes from a man named Leo, who, along with 2 friends, embarked on a camping trip deep into the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the trees grow thick and the nights are profoundly dark. They had hiked for hours to reach a remote spot, a small clearing by a creek, far from any established trail. The first evening was peaceful. They built a fire, cooked their food, and the familiar sounds of the forest, the crickets, the distant call of an owl, were a comfort. But as the fire died down to embers, a different feeling began to settle over Leo. It was a primal sensation, a slow creeping awareness that they were not alone. It wasn't a sound he could pinpoint, but a silence, a pocket of absolute quiet that seemed to be watching them from just beyond the ring of firelight. The next day, they hiked to a nearby ranger station to check their maps. Casually, Leo mentioned the odd feeling they'd had the night before. The ranger, an older man with a face carved by years in the mountains, grew quiet. He spoke of local folklore, of a presence the old-timers called the Woodwalker. It wasn't a ghost or an animal, but something that simply existed in the deep woods, a patient observer that mirrored the movements of those who ventured too far in. He told them it was harmless if left alone, but that it didn't like to be seen. The advice was simple: if you feel it, don't look for it. Just pack up and leave. That second night, the feeling was stronger. The circle of darkness around their camp felt like a solid wall. Leo woke sometime after midnight, his bladder full, but he found he couldn't move. A deep, instinctual fear had frozen him in his sleeping bag. He lay there, listening, and that's when he heard it. A soft, rhythmic crunching of leaves. It was the sound of something slowly, deliberately, circling their tent. He held his breath, praying it would pass. But then, the footsteps stopped. Right outside the thin nylon wall, directly next to his head, he sensed a presence. He could feel the air grow cold. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that something was standing there, motionless, just on the other side, listening to him breathe. He doesn't know how long it lasted. Eventually, the footsteps resumed, fading back into the trees. The moment they were gone, Leo shook his friends awake. He didn't explain. He just started frantically packing his gear. They broke camp in the pitch black, using their headlamps to find their way back, stumbling over roots and rocks in a frantic retreat. They didn't stop walking until the first rays of sun hit the trailhead parking lot hours later. Leo never went back to that part of the mountains. The experience left him with a lingering question, one that haunts him on quiet nights. What was really standing there in the dark? Was it an animal, a trick of the mind, or something else entirely? Something that walks the old woods and watches, forever patient, from just outside the light. It's a question that has no answer, only the quiet, unsettling weight of the unknown. Story 3. The Tenant Before Me. The next story moves us from the wild, open spaces back into the heart of a home. But it is a home that was never truly empty. This account comes from a woman named Sarah, who thought she had found the perfect apartment, an affordable, spacious one-bedroom in an older building with character. The previous tenant, she was told, had moved out suddenly. The landlord was eager to rent it, and Sarah was eager to move in. The first week was uneventful. She unpacked her boxes, arranged her furniture, and tried to make the space her own. But the apartment resisted. It had a strange, settled feeling, as if it were still holding the shape of the person who had lived there before. The first discovery was a small, tarnished silver locket, wedged between the back of a kitchen drawer and the cabinet frame. It felt cold and heavy in her hand. She assumed it was simply an oversight, a lost trinket from the previous occupant. A few days later, she found a note. It was slipped under her door, handwritten on a torn piece of paper. It read, "I left your book on the table. Don't forget it again." There was no book on her table. She dismissed it as a mistake, perhaps meant for another tenant, but the notes kept coming. "The faucet in the bathroom still drips. You said you'd fix it. You're playing the music too loud again." Each message was written in the same, slightly frantic script. They were always slipped under the door while she was out, or sometimes, more disturbingly, while she was asleep. The certainty began to grow, a cold seed of dread taking root in her stomach. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. The previous tenant hadn't just moved out. She had never left. Or rather, her presence hadn't. Sarah was being seamlessly inserted into another woman's life, expected to fulfill her promises, to live by her routines. The apartment wasn't just a space, it was a role waiting to be filled. The confrontation happened in the building's basement, a damp, low-ceilinged place she had avoided since moving in. A fuse had blown, and the circuit breaker was down there. She took a flashlight, the beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. In the farthest corner, behind a stack of old paint cans, she saw a small makeshift desk. On it sat a typewriter, an old manual model, covered in a fine layer of dust, and next to it was a neat stack of paper. Her heart hammered in her chest as she approached. She picked up the top sheet. It was a letter, typed. It began, "Dear Eleanor, I know you'll find this eventually. You were always the curious one." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor. The name from the first story, a coincidence that felt like a cold hand on her shoulder. The letter went on, describing the writer's life in the apartment, her loneliness, her small joys and frustrations. It spoke of watching the new tenants come and go, of how she would leave them little messages, hoping one of them would understand, would stay and keep her company. The final line was typed in all capitals. "Don't forget to check the attic." There was no attic in the building. Sarah dropped the letter as if it had burned her. The beam of her flashlight danced wildly across the concrete floor, illuminating something she had missed. Carved into the floor, right where she was standing, were two words, the letters rough and deep. "I'm here." She didn't go back to the apartment for her things. She called a friend from the sidewalk, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. She left everything behind, her furniture, her clothes, the life she had tried to build. Sometimes, she still wonders about the woman who typed that letter, about the truth waiting in that basement. But she knows, with a quiet, absolute certainty, that some spaces are not just occupied, they are claimed. And the previous tenant had no intention of ever giving up her lease. The decision to leave wasn't an option, it was an escape. Story 4. The reflection that didn't match. The next story is one of subtle, personal distortion, a quiet terror that unfolds not in a distant forest or a stranger's home, but in the most familiar of places, your own reflection. This account comes from a man named Ben, whose experience began with a simple, late-night ritual. He had woken up thirsty, the digital clock on his bedside table reading 2:17 a.m. The house was silent. He padded out to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and on his way back to bed, he passed the long hallway mirror. It was an old, ornate thing that had come with the house, and in the dim light from the street lamp outside, his reflection was a pale, ghostly smudge. He was halfway past it when he caught a flicker of movement. He stopped and looked back. His reflection had stopped a moment after he did. It was a tiny lag, almost imperceptible, like a video stream with a bad connection. He chalked it up to exhaustion and continued to his room. But the next night, it happened again. This time, he was more alert. He deliberately turned his head toward the mirror, and he saw it clearly. His reflection's head turned a fraction of a second later. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He tried a small wave. His reflection waved back, but the motion was slightly out of sync, the hand lifting and falling a heartbeat behind his own. It was no longer a trick of the light. It was a discrepancy. Ben remembered a piece of folklore his grandmother had once mentioned. Something about echo people, or mirror folk, entities that exist just on the other side of reflective surfaces, mimicking our every move until the moment they don't. The story claimed they were learning, studying us, waiting for an opportunity to cross over. He had always dismissed it as a silly ghost story. Now, standing in his hallway in the middle of the night, it felt terrifyingly plausible. He decided on a final test. The following evening he stood before the mirror, his heart thudding against his ribs. He looked his reflection directly in the eyes and slowly, deliberately, raised his right hand to scratch his left cheek. His reflection in the mirror raised its left hand to scratch its right cheek. A perfect mirror image. He let out a shaky breath, feeling a wave of relief. It was just his imagination. He started to turn away, and that's when he saw it. From the corner of his eye, he watched his reflection finish the motion. His own hand had already fallen back to his side, but in the mirror the hand was still moving, completing the scratch. Then, it lowered itself. But it didn't stop at the reflection's side. It kept going, dipping into the pocket of the reflected jeans. A pocket that, on Ben's real jeans, was empty. The reflection's hand emerged, holding something small and metallic that glinted in the low light. Something that did not exist on Ben's side of the glass. The reflection then looked up from its hand and met Ben's horrified stare in the mirror. And it smiled. It was a small, knowing smile, utterly alien on Ben's own face. In that moment, the connection shattered. The thing in the mirror was no longer mimicking him. It was asserting its own presence. Ben stumbled backward, crashing into the wall behind him. He didn't look back. He fled to his room and shoved a dresser in front of the door, a futile gesture against something that lived in glass and silver. He didn't sleep that night. The next day, he covered every mirror in the house with thick blankets, and he has avoided his reflection in shop windows and darkened screens ever since. He has learned to live with the quiet terror of not knowing what he might see looking back at him, or what it might do next. The simple act of seeing himself has become a thing of the past, a luxury he can no longer afford. Some reflections, he learned, are best left unobserved. Story 5. The Shared Dream. The final story is perhaps the most intimate, a quiet terror that unfolds not in the waking world, but in the shared space of sleep. This account comes from a woman named Clara, who for months was haunted by a recurring nightmare. It wasn't a chaotic dream of monsters or chases, but something far more precise and unsettling. She would find herself standing in a small, square room with faded yellow wallpaper. A single, bare light bulb hung from a chain in the center, casting long shadows. In the corner sat an old wooden rocking chair, and it was always rocking slowly back and forth, though the room was empty. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dried flowers. She would wake each time with a profound sense of sadness and a lingering chill. She mentioned the dream to her closest friend, Maya, one afternoon, thinking it was just a strange bit of personal trivia. But as Clara described the yellow wallpaper and the rocking chair, Maya's face went pale. She interrupted, finishing the description herself. The specific pattern of water stains on the ceiling, the sound of the floorboards creaking in a particular rhythm. They had been having the exact same dream, down to the most minute detail, for the same length of time. The realization was a cold shock. This was not a coincidence. It was a connection, a thread pulling them both into the same unknown space night after night. Driven by a mix of fear and a desperate need for answers, they decided to treat the dream as a real location. They spent weeks searching online, combing through real estate listings and historical archives for houses that matched the room's description. It was Maya who finally found it, a small abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a town 2 hours away. The listing photo, grainy and taken decades ago, showed a living room with unmistakable yellow wallpaper. They knew, with a certainty that felt like fate, that this was the place. The following weekend, they drove out there. The house stood alone at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, looking exactly as it did in their dreams, only more decayed. The front door was unlocked. Stepping inside was like walking directly into the nightmare. The smell was the same, dust and dried flowers. And there it was, the square room, the yellow wallpaper peeling at the seams, the chain hanging from the ceiling where the light bulb would have been. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own nervous breathing. Then, they heard it. The soft, rhythmic creak of the rocking chair. They turned slowly toward the corner. The chair was there, just as it always was. And it was moving, back and forth, as if someone had just stood up from it. But the room was empty. They stood frozen, watching the chair rock by itself in the dim light. There was no entity, no ghostly figure, just the motion. It was a quiet, mechanical terror. The realization that the dream was not a memory or a premonition, but a live feed. They had been visiting this room, and something in this room had been aware of their presence all along. They left without speaking. The image of the empty, rocking chair burned into their minds. They never went back, and they never spoke of it again after that day. The shared dreams stopped shortly thereafter, as if whatever connection had been established was finally severed. Clara is left with a quiet understanding, one that she carries with her always. Some doors are not meant to be opened, and some rooms are best left sleeping. The true horror was not the dream itself, but the confirmation that the barrier between our private minds and the outside world is far thinner and far more permeable than we ever dare to believe. If you stayed this far, comment pumpkin and we will like your comment. These 5 stories, these first-hand accounts and echoes of folklore, serve as a reminder that mystery is not something to be feared, but something to be acknowledged. In a world that often demands explanations for everything, these quiet terrors represent the spaces where answers simply do not exist. They are the whispers from the other side of the door, the shadows just beyond the firelight, the reflection that doesn't quite match. And in that acknowledgement, there is a strange comfort. Embracing the unknown allows us to release the need for control, to accept that some questions are meant to linger in the quiet hours of the night. Let these stories be a gentle guide, a companion in the darkness that helps you release the tensions of the day. If this journey into quiet terror has helped you relax, consider subscribing to Darkline for more stories to ease you into a peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next quiet hour.